Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection Commercial Feed Program Non-Medicated Feed Manufacturer webinar. I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. I am Heather Bartley, the feed specialist for the state of Wisconsin. I will be moderating today's session and will cover the tonnage and inspection fee reporting segment of today's webinar. Stephanie Statz, our feed and fertilizer label and sampling guru, will be going through the surveillance sampling project results with you. The better part of today's webinar will discuss inspections and will be presented by 4 of our inspectors. Chris Leto will start off the inspection section of the webinar with an overview of how enforcement works. Art Funk will then cover the building cleanliness expectations of an inspection. Zach Snobel will run through equipment cleanliness expectations, and KJ Dickman will wrap up the inspection session with labeling requirements for a variety of feed labels. Before we get started, I would like to run through a couple housekeeping items. First, please ensure your speakers are on and your microphone is on mute. In order to be sure we get through all of the presentation content, we have 30 minutes reserved for questions at the end. You are welcome to submit your questions into the chat box as we go, and we will answer those at the end. In the next hour, we will discuss commercial feed requirements pertaining to manufacturers that do not mix medicated feeds in Wisconsin. We're going to also talk about tonnage and the changes that took effect on January 1st of 2018, the sampling program, what that data shows right now, and how to make tweaks toward a positive improvement in sampling data, what to expect from an inspection, and last, we'll go through the label requirements for non-medicated feed tags. With that, we will start by going over the feed tonnage statute changes that took effect on January 1 of 2018. It is important to remember inspection fees and tonnage are 2 different things. The inspection fees are monies collected by the department and are assessed based on the quantity of feed sold or distributed. The fee is paid by the business that is first to distribute or sell the feed in or into the state of Wisconsin. Tonnage is the quantity of feed itself. Any person who is manufacturing in the state or distributing commercial feed in or into the state of Wisconsin is required to hold a valid commercial feed license issued by the department. This also applies to persons whose name and address appears on the label of a commercial feed as the guarantor of that feed. However, there are 3 exceptions to the licensing requirements. If you distribute commercial feed as it was packaged and labeled by a licensed manufacturer or distributor, you do not need a license. If you distribute bulk commercial feed as it was manufactured and labeled by a licensed manufacturer or distributor and repackage the bulk commercial feed into smaller containers, you do not need a license. The exception to not needing a license for repackaging bulk feed into smaller containers is when multiple bulk feeds are commingled and repackaged. Then a license is required. Lastly, if you distribute only custom mixed feed using ingredients that you purchased from other licensed manufacturers or distributors, you do not need a license. Please remember that a custom mixed feed is one that is formulated by the animal producer, and you as the manufacturer are not representing any nutritive guarantees for the finished feed. Remember that retailers are still exempt from licensing. When we talk about retailers, we are referring to entities that merely purchase and resell feed manufactured and labeled by a third-party feed company. We also want to clarify that with the statute changes, brokerages and distribution businesses that are first to distribute in or into the state would require a commercial feed license. There is a chance that those entities may have been able to conduct business in the past without being licensed. We look forward to working cooperatively to notify anyone who may not have needed a license in the past that may need a license going forward. In the past, the very first person to manufacture and distribute a feed, no matter how many times it changed hands, was responsible for reporting tonnage and remitting the inspection fees to the department. In today's world, that's no longer realistic. In layman's terms, the changes that took effect January 1 of 2018 bump the responsibility to the person or entity that is first to distribute a commercial feed in or into Wisconsin. In other words, if a feed moves from the original manufacturer in California to an animal producer in Wisconsin and changes hands 5 times along the way, The fifth person, the one that sold the feed to the animal producer in Wisconsin, is responsible for reporting the tonnage and remitting the inspection fees. If the feed was sold out of California to Wyoming, then to Iowa, then to Minnesota, and finally to Wisconsin, the Minnesota firm is responsible for reporting the tonnage and remitting the fees. Again, the fifth transaction is the only one to report the tonnage and remit the fees. Along with the change to the responsibility requirement, several other changes were made to the statute. One change was the implementation of a minimum inspection fee of $50 for 200 tons or less, including distributions of 0 tons. Another change made was removal of the exempt buyer license status option. This means that no licensee may apply for or receive exempt buyer status regardless of the amount of feed exported or distributed out of state. In other words, all licensees will be held to the very same requirements. Finally, all credit reporting requirements were removed. While prepaid purchases are no longer required to be reported to the department, please know you still can reduce your total tonnage by the cumulative total of commercial feeds and feed ingredients that another licensee first distributed in or into Wisconsin to you. All 4 changes, the responsibility of the tonnage reporting, the minimum inspection fee, the removal of the exempt buyer license status, and the reduced reporting requirements for credits, took effect on January 1st of 2018 and are applicable to reports filed in January 2019 and January 2020 and going forward. One last thing before we switch topics, in 2019 and 2020, the feed program staff worked with a group of industry members to revise and create some documents to help making reporting tonnage easier. The documents are available on our website and are ready for you to print and use.
Now we'll transition to the manufacturing side of things and start by going through feed surveillance sampling conducted by the department. In the years before I started with the department, sample quantities and types were not representative of the quantity of feed out in commerce. Staff worked together on a Six Sigma project and ultimately learned the program needed a higher quantity of samples from a diverse portfolio of feeds to put together a more representative data set. Using that justification, we assembled a feed sampling program that meets those stipulations and is feasible with the resources available. Before we start going through the data, I'd like to point out that pet food, which refers explicitly to dog or cat food, does also get sampled. Specialty pet foods, critters like fish, hermit crabs, gerbils, and other cage-type animals, pets that are not livestock, get sampled with the livestock feeds as a part of the regular surveillance sampling program. Most recently, we conducted a sampling project in 2017 that tested 100 samples of wet and dry dog and cat foods. The summary of the project is on our website. Ultimately, pet food is a sole source diet and it gets run for a full nutrient profile of protein, fat, vitamins, minerals, and amino acids, up to 27 different analytes. When it was all said and done, the pet foods had an 85% passing rate. I'll ask you to keep that number in your mind because we're going to come back to it in a few minutes. Feed surveillance samples consist of livestock feeds like cattle, swine, chicken, and horse feeds, and specialty pet foods like gerbil, hamster, aquarium fish, and aquarium reptile foods, as well as some single ingredients and drug and mineral premixes. The other thing to keep in mind is that no matter how many different analytes or nutrients we run on a feed, if it fails in one, the entire sample is considered a fail. With that, as you can see, the overall sample results are trending at a 58% plus pass rate. I have some additional breakdowns for you, but remember, regulatorily, we have to look at sample results like you see them here. As such, I'm presenting this data to you as a heads up and as an effort to educate and cooperate with you in bringing the passing rate to a better number. Ideally, we would love to see 100% passing, but that's not realistic. We want samples to pass at a rate that is as high as possible. But if we saw the pass rate hit 85% or better, I think everyone would feel a lot better about looking at it up on a screen like this. Remember back on slide 11 when we looked at the pet food samples and how all 100 of those samples were run for anywhere between 25 to 27 analytes? This line graph shows you how many analytes we ran on surveillance livestock feed and specialty pet food samples. The bulk of our samples were run for 4 to 9 different analytes. We had some outliers where 3 samples were run for 15 or 17 analytes, and 89 samples were run for 1 analyte. Those 1 analyte feeds are predominantly custom mixes that we only ran for a drug level. Looking at this chart, I personally think that if pet food can pass 85% of the time when run for 25 to 27 analytes, the rest of our feeds and distribution can pass 85% of the time when we run for 4 to 9 analytes. It's just going to take some tweaks. Think of it as an enormous control panel with hundreds of knobs. No one knob is the magic key to an 85% passing rate. It will take some trial and error and some turning of multiple knobs to get our passing rate up there, but it is achievable. If a person looks at the analytes run on an individual basis, the results are pretty darn good. That just emphasizes the ability to improve to me. Since every analyte has a fairly respectable passing rate for the most part, we just need to tweak a little bit to get all of the analytes to pass. If we look at the 3 primary analytes, protein, fat, fiber, as pictured here, we started out in 2015 and 2016 with only protein struggling to meet or exceed 85%. By 2017, protein was up to 82%, a big improvement in just 3 years. The fat and fiber, as you can see, were well within an acceptable passing rate. Most recently, protein ran at an 83% passing rate, which is almost to the 85% goal. This slide looks at a few miscellaneous analytes: acid detergent fiber, amino acids, non-protein nitrogen, and a couple minerals. Overall, everything on a per analyte basis looks good again. Note that in 2017, our methods for lysine and methionine went down, so those results are displaying as a failure, when really they should be neither a pass or a fail. Some of the other analytes we run that won't fit on the display in front of you include minerals like cobalt, copper, iron, magnesium, manganese, and phosphorus. The results for those look like the ones on display, really good passing rates per analyte. If you have an interest in seeing the detailed data beyond what we've seen today, please contact someone from the department to put in an open records request. In summary, because the department has to use the overall sample result, we are asking firms to ensure they are utilizing the tips on this slide to help boost the passing rate from the current average of 56% to 85% or better. Rather than run through these, I'll just let you know that they are also available on a handout that is available as a download for this webinar. If you have anything that you'd like to discuss with regard to sampling that you don't want to go through in a public setting, please feel free to contact me. Next, we're going to go through feed inspections and what you should expect when your state feed inspector visits.
Okay, now we're going to go through feed inspections and what to expect when your state feed inspector visits. First, let's cover the enforcement activity related to inspections. Field staff generally try to educate before they regulate, and will strive to inform facility staff how to comply before going to the verbal or written warnings or the civil or criminal fines. It is worth pointing out that the feed program has only recently acquired civil penalty authority in 2017. Prior to that, enforcement actions could only go this criminal penalty route. The department strives for uniformity in all aspects of the feed program. That is related to what the field staff inspect for, what they are looking to see and what they expect to see, and how they utilize enforcement action when there is a violation. All that said, multiple factors have an impact on enforcement decisions, such as employee turnover, compliance history, type of violation, severity of the violation, and most importantly, the health and safety risk to animals and people. In some cases, companies have multiple facilities, and that can play a role in the enforcement action decision as well. Let's move on to what to expect from an inspection so that enforcement actions don't have to be a decision with an inspection at your facility. Every non-medicated feed manufacturer inspection has 4 key aspects. The main things an inspector will look for are a current feed license, cleanliness of your building and equipment, proper record keeping and retention of records, and adequate labels for all commercial feeds and feed ingredients.
When the inspector first arrives at your facility, he or she will request to meet with the most responsible person on site. The most responsible person and possibly other employees will be interviewed for the duration of the inspection and will be expected to answer or acquire an answer related to the good manufacturing practices and standard operating procedures in use at your facility. Initially, the inspector will do a walkthrough of the facility to look at the cleanliness and maintenance of the buildings and equipment inside and out. The inspector will look to ensure that there is minimal or no evidence of rodents, vermin, birds, or insects. Part of that will include an overview of pest control. If your facility uses its own pest control, our inspectors are educated in the use of pesticides and can answer any compliance questions you may have related to the pesticides in an animal food producing facility. Your inspector will be firm on requesting cleanup when necessary, especially with today's heightened awareness of biosecurity related to avian influenza, African swine fever, and other infectious diseases. This is where we will strongly discourage the reuse of feed bags, as biological contaminants are not visible to the naked eye. Inspectors are looking to ensure physical contaminants or potential adulterants like stored pesticides, fertilizer, non-food grade grease, or cleaning compounds are stored in a separate segregated area. During the outside walkabout, the inspector will be looking for areas that may harbor pests or grant access to your facility, such as significant holes or openings in the wall or floor or overgrown foliage. This photograph demonstrates what we're talking about on the outside of a facility, overgrowth of plants. Not only does the foliage provide a place for pests to reside, it could also hide access points for rodents and other vermin. Similarly, in the top left of this photo, we see a stack of pallets leaning against the wall. Rodents love to live in these types of materials, especially when there is an access point down the wall, like the holes in the tin of this building in the center of the picture. A wet floor is a strong hint to an inspector that they should look at the ceiling for holes in the roof. Sometimes facilities do wet cleaning and the water on the floor is not because of a leaky roof. Obviously, leaks can damage the integrity of packaging and cause bags to tear and spill or mold the feed. Feed mills commonly experience bird activity. Inspectors will look to see that the bird population and activity is controlled as much as possible. Bird droppings carry diseases like histoplasmosis, which can cause high fever, blood abnormalities, pneumonia, and even death in humans. Facilities have instituted a variety of methods to control birds: nets, plastic flaps over doors, or visual repellents like predators or reflective bird diverters. The outside walkabout will look at spillage from outside feed via legs, bins, loading areas, and unloading areas. Spills such as one in this photo must be cleaned up. The spilled feed attracts the pests we are striving so hard to keep away, and it can be a source of mold. Dust from regular manufacturing activities is expected and acceptable. However, inspectors are taught to see the difference between fresh dust accumulations and buildup from a long period of time. Remember, the best way to demonstrate an SOP is to have the documentation to support it. It isn't required, and it is still acceptable if your facility is apparently undergoing regular cleaning without documentation to substantiate the routine housekeeping. Remind employees to keep an eye open for ripped and torn bags. Sometimes they come that way from suppliers. Sometimes someone is texting and driving the forklift. Your inspector is going to work with you. However, they want to see an effort to ensure spills are getting cleaned up promptly.
After reviewing the housekeeping, your inspector will look for adequate procedures related to equipment cleanout. The procedures shall be established and used for all equipment used in the production and distribution of non-medicated feeds to avoid unsafe contamination of non-medicated feeds. In other words, your inspector is looking to hear about NC production and control procedures that prevent unsafe contamination of feeds by residual feed material in mixers, legs, bins, trucks, baggers, and other equipment. Sequencing, flushing, and physical cleanout are all acceptable ways to mitigate the potential risks. Your inspector is going to request visual inspection access whenever possible. Here are photos that document the inside of bulk delivery trucks. The top right photo could be a little cleaner. There is some lingering feed down by the auger. In preparing for FSMA, I have heard of certain ingredients like urea that carry a static charge so that it clings to equipment. Firms that deliver feed should consider sequencing, flushing, or physically clean out of trucks in addition to the main mixers, as well as of a sufficient quantity of material that will adequately mitigate the risk of unwanted carryover. Mixers are the obvious piece of equipment when it comes to flushing, sequencing, and physical cleanout. Manufacturing with molasses and/or fats can create buildup a lot quicker than a mill that doesn't mix with molasses or fat. Please take that into consideration when establishing equipment cleanout procedures. It may mean that your facility has to tweak the cleanout frequency based on the seasons. Ultimately, we are encouraging these practices because we want you to avoid this. The photo on this slide is of a hunk of ribbon buildup material that fell off into a bag of feed. Not only would this raise consumers' eyebrows, but it could contain elevated levels of nutrients such as copper or selenium. The department is often requested to conduct an investigation into situations like the one I just described. Subsequent to the investigation, the complainant can request a copy of the investigation file and they can pursue their own case as a civil matter. Proactive measures such as adequate cleanout, sequencing, and flushing can prevent such scenarios. That wraps up the Good Manufacturing Practices, or GMPs, portion of our webinar. As I mentioned earlier, this segment is going to go through the requirements for feed labels, medicated and non-medicated.
This slide displays the differences between label types and feed types. As you can see from this chart, in regulation, we have three kinds of feed types: branded, which is also referred to as floor stock, mill formulated, and custom mixed. Let me talk about the three types of feeds for a minute. Branded feeds or floor stock feeds are those feeds that your feed mill formulates and stocks to sell to any customer that walks in the door. There's no special formulation. It is just a standardized feed for a single species or sometimes multiple species that anyone can buy. A lot of times this will include those feeds that your facility recalls for another larger manufacturer. Branded feeds are, as I mentioned a minute ago, mill formulated feeds. Because your mill formulated the feed to meet a specific purpose, it has a nutritional backing to it. In other words, your mill guarantees the feed to provide a certain level of a number of ingredients. It is important to point out that the phrasing branded feeds isn't something you'll find in regulation. Regulation basically points to what we call branded feeds as commercial feed. Well, since everything we look at is technically commercial feed, in order to provide a level of distinction to everyone involved, we call the commercial feed bearing the standardized label that we'll discuss in a few slides branded feed. That brings us to mill formulated feeds. Remember, we just said branded feeds are also considered mill formulated feeds. What else is a mill formulated feed? The other mill formulated feeds that are not branded feeds are the customer specific mill formulated feeds. If your mill has one or more nutritionists on staff, and those nutritionists develop formulas for livestock feeds for certain purposes, those are mill formulated feeds. They are customer specific mill formulated feeds, where an employee of the mill developed the formula for just that one individual customer. Our last type of feed is custom mixed feed. In regulatory speak, the definition of custom mixed feeds differs a bit from the way the phrase is used in industry. In industry, a custom mixed feed could refer to a feed formula that was developed by the mill, a third-party nutritionist, or the customer himself. The regulatory definition of a custom mixed feed is limited to feeds mixed at the customer's request using quantities specifically directed by the customer. Custom mixed feeds do not have a nutritional guarantee for any nutrients. That leads us to how the feed types are labeled. Branded feeds, remember, regulatory, that's just a commercial feed, are labeled in the branded format. That's a standard tag we're used to seeing with the feed name, guaranteed analysis, etc. There is no option on that. Branded feeds are all required to bear that standardized format style tag. Similarly, custom mixed feeds, remember those are the ones the customer requested with specific ingredient inclusion rates per the customer, are to be labeled in the custom mixed format. A custom mixed format tag is the invoice tag that pretty much is a line-by-line itemized invoice. Finally, the mill formulated feeds. Remember, a mill formulated feed can be for any customer as a floor stock feed, or a mill formulated feed might be for one customer. A mill formulated feed, when developed as a floor stock feed, must be labeled in the branded format. A mill formulated feed developed for a specific individual customer can be labeled at the customer's option, either in a branded format or a custom mixed format. It's up to the customer. Just a quick reminder as you think of questions, please write them down. We've reserved about 30 minutes at the end to take your questions. Now that all that is clear as mud, let's walk through a few examples. You should see a branded label for a non-medicated feed on your screen. It has a specific format and order to the label components. At the very top, regulations outline placement for the product name and brand name where applicable. There isn't a lot of detail regarding the product and brand names other than they must be truthful and not false, deceptive, or misleading. Second from the top of the label, a person will find the purpose statement. A purpose can be drafted in one of two ways. It can identify the species and classes of the animals for which the feed is intended and the specific use of the feed. Alternatively, the purpose could outline the species and weight ranges or species and age ranges of the animals for which the feed is intended, as well as the intended use of the feed. The only reason the intended use of the feed would not be included in the purpose of the feed is intended as a complete feed. First from the top of the label will be guaranteed analysis. Guarantees depend heavily on the purpose statement. If the feed is intended for specific species of animals, the guarantees will be derived from the requirements for the one or more species of animals in the purpose statement. If the feed is not species specific, but rather a specialty supplement, such as amino acid premix, then the guarantees would not need to be developed to substantiate the presence of the promised amino acids in the feed. Fourth down from the top is the ingredient statement. The ingredient statement follows a format most are familiar with on any type of human or animal food label, where every single ingredient in the feed is listed in order of the most to least by the common or defined name. For example, a person would list salt instead of sodium chloride in the ingredient statement. In addition, ingredients cannot be listed by brand names. For example, if a mill uses a vitamin premix called VitaBlend, the individual vitamins comprising that premix must be listed in the finished feed label's ingredient statement. The label would not be compliant by listing VitaBlend in the ingredient statement. The fifth label component down from the top is the use directions. This section would also be called feeding directions or mixing directions. Immediately following the use directions would be the precautionary statements. The label on your screen is for a feed containing a non-protein nitrogen source, so are there cautions related to the presence of an NPN. The sixth or second to last to label component is the manufacturer's information. It must include the company name, city, state, and zip code. The option piece is to include a street address and phone number. Some firms also choose to include an email address. At minimum though, the manufacturer information will need to have the company name, city, state, and zip code. Finally, the last or seventh label component from the top is the net quantity. Bulk feeds can just list bulk. Packaged feeds should identify how much feed is in the container using suitable units of liquid or dry measure in both metric and imperial units. Most commonly, we see packages of 50-pound feed, which equate to 22.67 kilograms. When it comes to a single ingredient feed and custom mixes, the requirements change a little, but the premise is still the same. Here is an example of a single ingredient feed label. These labels are usually simpler than complete feed labels. At the very top, regulations outline placement for the product name and brand name where applicable. In place of a product name, a firm can just use the defined ingredient name. In the example in front of you, the firm opted to do just so and call it solvent extracted soybean meal. By using the defined ingredient name, oftentimes the firm is exempt from including an ingredient statement further down on the label, since it would be redundant information. Second from the top of the label, the person will find the purpose statement. For single ingredients, especially those that are defined by AAFCO, the purpose is generally going to be for further manufacture of animal feed. Using such a general statement keeps a facility from having to include use directions on the label, with a few exceptions. Some defined ingredients, depending on what they are, may require use directions to ensure that limitations and cautions are clearly portrayed to the user. For example, urea, as a non-protein nitrogen ingredient, would not be exempt from the use directions. Third from the top of the label will be guaranteed analysis. Guarantees depend heavily on the purpose statement. If the feed is intended for the specific species of animals, the guarantees will be derived from the requirements for the one or more species of animal in the purpose statement. If the feed is not species specific, but rather a specialty supplement, such as an amino acid premix, then the guarantees would need to be developed to substantiate the presence of the promised amino acids in the feed. Fourth down from the top is the ingredient statement. If it is required, when a single ingredient labeled with a product is the name of that defined ingredient, such as the one on your screen, an ingredient statement is not required because it would be redundant. However, the feed is given a product name different from the defined ingredient name, an ingredient statement is required. Just like a complete feed, the ingredient statement lists every single ingredient in the feed in the order of the most to least by the common or defined name. In instances where the product name on the label is the defined ingredient name, but a technical or processing additive is included in the feed, such as a flow aid or anti-caking agent or preservative, an ingredient statement is required so that the business customers are aware of the presence of that processing aid or technical additive. Again, looking at the label on your screen, if Bob's feed mill had included calcium carbonate as an anti-caking agent, an ingredient statement would be required for disclosure of the calcium carbonate. The fifth label component down from the top are the use directions, if required. Most of the time, ingredients are used for further manufacture, so the section would be best titled as mixing instructions. Immediately following the use directions would be the precautionary statements when applicable. The last two label components required to be in the same order as a finished feed label are the manufacturer's information and at the bottom of the label, the net quantity. The standard for both label components is the same as a complete feed label. The manufacturer's information must carry the company name, city, state, and zip code. The net quantity can be the word bulk for bulk feeds, or it can be listed in both the imperial and metric units for the contents of a packaged ingredient. The last label we're going to go through is a customer-specific feed. Similar to branded feeds, non-medicated custom feeds require label contents to provide information about the feed. As you can see from the example on your screen, the custom mix feed label is literally a line item invoice displaying 7 specific label components. The required elements include the name and address of the manufacturer, the name and address of the customer, the date the feed was sold or delivered to the customer, the name of the custom mix feed, the net quantity of the entire batch, the name and net quantity or inclusion rate of each of the individual ingredients in the feed, and any corresponding use directions or precautionary statements for the feed. A couple of things to point out. When naming the feed, it doesn't need to be anything special. It just needs to be a way to discern one feed from another feed for that customer. List the line items on the invoice according to brand name. That way, if there is a recall on one brand but not another, you don't find yourself having to recall every feed that contains the general ingredients, just the ones that contain that brand of ingredient. Last, use directions wouldn't necessarily apply to all custom feeds, especially not ones that were formulated by the customer. Those are pretty rare anymore, but they occasionally come in. Custom feeds that would require use directions are the ones that contain ingredients like non-protein nitrogen or prefixes for TMRs that have high levels of selenium. Essentially, we're looking for use directions on feeds containing ingredients or nutrients that could cause a human or animal health or safety risk. If a custom feed gets bagged off per customer's request, please remember to attach a unique identifier to each individual bag of feed. If the customer requests a bulk delivery, then the feed only needs a copy of the one or more documents that contain all the information shown in the example on your screen. I want to run through the unique identifiers one more time because those seem to be one of the easiest forgotten pieces to labeling custom mixed feeds. When a customer orders their own feed, whether it is mill formulated, formulated by a third party, or something they pick themselves, a label is required. For bulk feeds, the label has to accompany the load. For bag feeds, the main labels can accompany the load as long as a unique identifier is attached to each bag. Anything that is specific to that batch of feed at hand can be used on the unique identifier to associate the bags of feed to the invoice. If your inspector observes bag feed on the dock or in the warehouse released for shipment without those identifiers, the product will be placed under a department holding order. Here are two examples of the way a Wisconsin manufacturer went about labeling bagged custom mixed feed with unique identifiers. The mailing labels can be folded over the string that ties the poly bag shut, provided all the contents remain legible. There is no wrong way to label a bag with a unique identifier, provided all the required information is visible. The other piece I would like to reiterate related to custom mixed format feeds is the way the ingredients are listed on the invoice. Remember that a custom mixed format label must list each individual ingredient out with its inclusion rate on the invoice. There cannot be one line item on the invoice that states the name of the feed. It must be each individual ingredient. Furthermore, each individual ingredient must be listed by the actual product name, not just the general ingredient name. The reason for that is potential recall purposes. If an ingredient is recalled, you'll have a better idea of which feeds use that ingredient and need to be recalled. Hand in hand with listing the ingredients correctly on an invoice-style custom mix label is retention of the custom mix feed records. The formulation and labeling that apply for every custom mix feed your facility manufactures must be held for at least 1 year according to regulation. It is certainly your option to hold on to records for a longer period of time and to retain more than just custom mix feed records. With that, we'll open up the presentation to questions. First, let's go through the questions in the chat box. Remember, if you want to ask something very specific, please contact any of us directly based on the subject of your question.
Thanks, KJ. At this time, we will open up the line for questions. I do have one question in the chat box to get us started. If we have a product made for further manufacturing, and the purpose is to improve palatability but not for vitamins, what needs to be included in the guaranteed analysis portion of the label? That's a great question, and the answer to that is if it's a flavoring, which to me, a purpose of improving palatability sounds like a flavoring, so it's not intended to provide any nutrients per se, and the inclusion rate of a flavoring is typically very low, so it wouldn't provide much for nutrition to the animal anyway. There would not be a guaranteed analysis on that label. However, if there's a technical additive in that flavoring that has a limitation on its use, then that technical additive does need to be declared on the label. I'm drawing a blank on an example right now, but there's certain preservatives and other ingredients that could potentially be in a flavoring or in a feed. And those ingredients need to be declared, those technical additives, preservatives or such, need to be declared on the label so that as they move forward through the chain of distribution, the subsequent suppliers or manufacturers know the level of that ingredient, because they don't want to get beyond the limitation of the inclusion rate in the finished feed. So let's just say we have a preservative that can't exceed 2% of the finished ration. We want to make sure that every ingredient label that provided that technical additive declares the level of that technical additive in those ingredients, because that way, as we work to formulate finished feeds, we can include or not include certain ingredients because they contain that additive, and we don't want to go beyond that 2% limitation. I have a second question in the chat box. How will you know if you are the last person who is selling the feed product? Typically, because Wisconsin is first to distribute in or into the state, you want to know if you're the first to distribute in or into the state. Usually the last person is the one who is selling something to an end consumer. When I say end consumer, I mean someone who is feeding that feed or feed ingredient to animals. There's occasions where that's not always the case, but if you are first to distribute, you're usually the initial or original manufacturer of something. So if we have a mining company that is mining calcium carbonate, what they distribute is calcium carbonate. They are the first to distribute that calcium carbonate into in Wisconsin, depending on where that mine is located. If we have a soybean meal processor or an ethanol plant, typically those firms are the first to distribute in or into Wisconsin, again, depending on their location, whether it's in or into. Their byproducts are intended for use in animal feed, whereas a raw agricultural commodity, such as corn, it could be used for food or it could be used for feed. So as a raw agricultural commodity, corn is actually exempt from the commercial feed definition as a whole, unprocessed, and unmixed seed, because it has a variety of uses, and it is not determined yet what that corn would be used for. If the corn gets mixed with oats, that mixture then would fall under the definition of commercial feed, because typically that kind of a mixture is going to be used for animal feed. It's not going to be planted, we'll say. We have a couple more. They're rolling into the chat box here, so I'm just going to kind of keep going with these. Our next question in the chat box is, if I buy ingredients from out-of-state suppliers and bring them to our mill in Wisconsin to blend them, send them to a customer, do I or the supplier pay the tax? So the out-of-state supplier is distributing to a Wisconsin company. That is the entity that is first distributing something into Wisconsin. Just for an example, I know Minnesota has a number of ethanol plants and soybean meal processors that distribute their soybean meal and their distillers grains into Wisconsin. Those soybean meal plants and ethanol plants in Minnesota would be responsible for reporting the tons and remitting the inspection fees applicable to those tons when it's distributed into Wisconsin. We have some sunflower seeds, for example, are pretty common out in the Dakotas. So when those suppliers distribute their dehulled sunflower seeds to the state of Wisconsin, that's the first distribution into Wisconsin. Whereas we have some facilities that make something that could be any variety of uses, such as milk products, whey in particular, that's commonly used in human food. It's also common to milk replacers. If it's sold as a food, then it would not yet be considered feed. So at the time it becomes feed, it's reportable. if that makes sense. So say we have a milk plant a plant in Wisconsin that sells whey, and it's edible grade whey. If animal feed manufacturers are purchasing that whey, then those animal feed manufacturers purchasing the human food grade whey are responsible for reporting the tons and remitting the fees, because it's not yet feed until it leaves that facility, because that's all human food processing, a facility and GMPs. At the point it enters the feed plant, it becomes feed and it becomes reportable. Our next question is, we make deproteinized whey. We sometimes sell this as an undergrade whey to brokers who then sell it as feed. What should this be labeled as? If it is feed, it needs to be labeled as feed. Whey is a defined ingredient for animal feed, and it would need to be labeled with you can either use the AFCO name or you can come up with a brand name. The purpose statement, the guarantees, if you decide to use a brand name, then it needs to include an ingredient statement. If it's using the AFCO name and it's the defined name, then there's no ingredient statement. Whey is pretty commonly understood to be a protein providing ingredient, so there wouldn't be any use directions. There's no limitations on whey as far as inclusion in animal feed, so there's no use directions required. You're certainly more than welcome to include something on your label that is beyond the requirements, more than what's required. You can certainly do that at your option, and then the manufacturer information and the net quantity. So that's kind of an example of a whey feed label. There's a practice of including a plant number on a lot of food products or food ingredients. That's not a requirement for animal feed. I'll just tell you, in Wisconsin, we wouldn't make you take that off the label. I have heard other states say that because that's a food requirement and we're trying to delineate between the food and the feed grade ingredients, those other states would require removal of that plant information. So just as a reminder, this webinar has been on the requirements in the state of Wisconsin. If you are distributing into other states, you would just want to check with the regulations in those states to make sure that you comply with their requirements as well. Generally speaking, requirements are pretty equivalent across the nation, but there are some nuances depending on the state you're in. And the guarantees or the nutrient values for food ingredients, it's kind of a question in relation to the nutrient values when something was manufactured for human consumption, but it comes out as downgraded and it's for animal food. The nutrient guarantees are not necessarily something that is in an AFCO definition. It is a thing for some ingredients, but not all ingredients. And without having my AFCO book in front of me, I would like to say I'm an encyclopedia of all defined ingredient requirements, but unfortunately, on the top of my head, I can't think of what the whey definition outlines as far as nutrient values, or if it even has them in there at all. So we would have to touch base on the side if you wanted to know more about that. Sometimes there are ingredient definitions that require a set value for nutrients in the feed, and your ingredient might not meet those, so then we would need to circle back and look, maybe there's a different feed ingredient that would fit this downgraded ingredient. Another question in the chat box before we move to the phone. We sell an ingredient labeled for human food to pet food manufacturers. Are we required to provide different ingredient labeling for pet food? And then the second question I will get to in a second. No, ingredient labeling is the same regardless of the intended use, meaning the intended species. That being said, your pet food manufacturers might want to see maybe a certificate of analysis or some other information. Again, you're more than welcome to include above and beyond what the requirements are on your label, as long as it is truthful, not false, deceptive, or misleading, or you can include more than one document with your shipment. But the ingredient labels are generally, as we saw back a couple slides ago, as KJ was running through the single ingredient feed label. I want to say it was slide 36. We also have an example of that in a handout that's downloadable from the commercial feed page of the department website. It's https://datcp.wi.gov. You'll see the longer link to the inspector map at the bottom of the slide in front of you. If you just abbreviate that back to the main homepage, you would be able to navigate to the commercial feed page and find those additional label guide handouts that are on our website. The second question was those pet food ingredients, are we required to pay inspection fees? It's commonly referred to by industry as a tax. It's actually an inspection fee. Those are segregated funds. They fund the feed program, and all ingredients, all commercial feeds are indeed subject to reporting and inspection fees. Again, that responsibility falls on the first entity to distribute in or into Wisconsin. So even though it's intended for pet food is still commercial feed. In Wisconsin, we're a little different from other states. We have a commercial feed, which is all major livestock species and specialty pet foods. And then we have a whole different set or a subchapter in our regs in regards to pet foods. Pet food is only dog or cat food or treats. So some states have a specialty pet food law as well, and that's for those gerbils, hamsters, birds, goldfish, and so forth. We don't have a specialty pet food law. We only have pet food and livestock feed. So specialty pet food is regulated under the livestock feed requirements at this time in Wisconsin. So that kind of wraps up the questions that have been submitted in our chat box. I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask them on the phone, or you can still continue to submit them in the chat box, and we will answer them as they come up. If you have questions that are specific to your company that you kind of want to discuss on the side, you're more than welcome to call any of your inspectors if you're in Wisconsin. Otherwise, if you're an out-of-state firm, you can call into the office. My contact information is on the slide. Stephanie Stats, our feed and fertilizer sampling and label review specialist, her contact info is on the slide, and then the unit supervisor, Andrew Del Santo, his contact is on the slide as well. So remember, we are unmuted. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to submit those into the phone. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted for later viewing on our website. The pet food webinar that was 2 weeks ago is already posted on our website. And we do have 4 different medicated feed webinars. One was last week, and we have 3 more coming up. We will only post one of those since the content is all the same. And those will all, again, be available for you to view and pause and take notes and things like that. So if you have any questions on the phone, you can speak up now. I'm not hearing any questions on the phone, and it doesn't look like we're getting any more in the chat box. So I think we're going to end the webinar here, and we thank all of you for your time. We will follow up the webinar with a survey. Please take time to complete the survey. It's going to be used for future webinars, and also we have a couple other projects going on. You heard about the tonnage work group that's out there. We are using some of your feedback in relation to that tonnage project, and we also have a sampling outreach project that we have a couple questions geared towards. We would use your responses to those questions for that project as well. We thank you for your time and in advance for your feedback via the survey, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.